May the words of my mouth, holy God, and all of our thoughts this day be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength, our rock, our refuge, and our Redeemer. Amen. Drop a pebble in the water, just a splash, and it's gone. But there's 100 ripples circling on and on and on, spread and spreading from the center, flowing on out to the sea. And there ain't no way of telling where the end is going to be. Drop a pebble in the water, in a minute ye forget. But there's little waves of flowing and the ripples circling yet. All the ripples flowing to a mighty wave have grown. And you've disturbed a mighty river just by dropping in a stone. It's an excerpt from a poem by James William Foley, born around 1875 and died in 1939. Foley's poem describes the impact that we have on one another by dropping a pebble in the water and watching the ripple effects begin to change what's around it. Some of those changes we get to see, and some of those changes we don't. Here are two different stories of persons dropping a pebble in the water in my life. One was just this past Wednesday. It was Halloween night, and I'd been sitting on the front stoop handing out candy to all those costumed trick-or-treaters who came by. Well, I underestimated how many people would come by, so I ran out of candy. So at some point, I shut the door and went inside. I didn't turn off the light. So about 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. The doorbell rang. And so I went to the peephole and peered through, and I saw a clown with brightly colored curly hair and a striped costume. He was about 10 or 11 years old with a big smile on his face. So I opened the door, and he held up his pillowcase and said, "Trick or treat." And I said, "I am so sorry. I just ran out of candy, and I don't have anything to give you. I hope the next house treats you much better." I said, "I'm so sorry about this." And he just smiled, and he said, "That's okay." And he went on his merry way. I closed the door and went inside. About 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. And I peered through the peephole. It was a clown with brightly colored curly hair and a striped costume, about 10, 11 years old, the same clown. And I thought, what is he thinking? I didn't have time to run to the store in the 5 minutes before he came back, and I thought, I'm just going to have to apologize again. So I opened the door, and before I could say it, he said, "I have lots of candy. You can have some of mine." I said, "What?" He said, "I've got lots." He said, so we argued about it for a little while, and I finally agreed to take 3 pieces in case someone else came by. So he reached in his pillowcase, he got 3 pieces out and handed them to me, and then he said, "I have loads, take more." And he filled my hands with gobs of candy out of his pillowcase he had with him. And so I took it inside. I told him he was my very favorite clown. And I told him goodbye, and I thanked him for everything that evening. And not too long after that, about 7 different trick-or-treaters came by, and don't you know, I had enough for all of them. We even had a little to keep at the house after the door was finally shut for the night. That's the kind of pebble that someone can drop in the water. When I grow up, I want to be like that 10-year-old. His kindness impacted me, 7 other trick-or-treaters, and my family to boot, with a little more candy around in the house. And here's another story. The next day, I was out walking, like I often do. And there's a spot in the neighborhood where there are 4 stop signs and 4 crosswalks. And I was just about to enter one of the crosswalks. Some vehicles came up, and they stop and they wait. And so I went all the way through the crosswalk, and when I got to the sidewalk, someone leaned a head out of a window and yelled derisively, "Walk faster." And then they laughed, and the guy gunned it, and they drove off. And I thought, man, if you only knew how hard I've been working to get better. And then I thought, my goodness, how is it that he grew up in a world where he learned that it was okay to mock other people? And how did he grow up in a world where he thought that it was okay to yell at strangers out the window in derision? And then I thought, what about the children sitting in the back seat behind him? And what did they learn that day from the adults who were sitting in the front? That's a very different kind of ripple effect to create from dropping a pebble of derision in the water. Today's scripture invites us to examine stories like that. It invites us to examine the ripples that we create by the kinds of pebbles that we drop in the water in interaction after interaction after interaction, some of which build up, some of which tear down. The passage that was read today for us is built on all that has come before it in this letter. I mentioned last week that in the first 3 chapters of Ephesians in this sermon series, we've read about a new kingdom and a new way already established by God through Christ. We read that we are chosen, adopted, and redeemed by God through Christ. We read that we are united and reconciled to God and to one another through Christ. And Christ has proclaimed peace already in our midst. And the good news of the first 3 chapters sounds great. But then the 4th chapter comes, and that word therefore shows up, if you might remember from last week. It's the pivot in the letter. And so in the last 3 chapters of Ephesians, we learn about how to live out and put skin on the first 3 chapters. And we read verse after verse that it is hard work. It's where the rubber meets the road. It comes down to everyday interactions, how we speak and how we act with people we know and people we don't. At work, at school, at Safeway, at the variety store, at the pastry shop, while we're out trick-or-treating, or while we're driving with kids in the back seat watching everything we do. And even our day-to-day choices that we make with those closest to us at home. Chapter 4 begins by saying that you know what peace and unity God has made possible. Now, here's how you start to put that into action and put skin on the love of God in Jesus Christ and choose to live a mature life worthy of such a gift. So here we are, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The verses from today are a list of moral exhortations to that end, saying basically, here's a short list of how you do it. Tell the truth. Learn to deal with your anger. Share with others. Speak encouraging words. Put away what damages relationships and take on behaviors that build them up instead. These choices, Ephesians says, are unmistakable markers of God's love and grace made real in the community. It's the stuff my dad might tell me of growing up. For all of us, no matter how old or young we are, no matter what positions we hold or don't, this is the stuff of accountability and maturing in faith as a disciple of Jesus Christ, because it's about awareness of the community and our impact on it by choosing to live out the witness of a loving God. Each of the verses comes down to the ripples that we make in the water. These verses remind us that what I do affects you and what you do affects me, and we're in the river together where everyone's dropping stones. What kind of stones will we put in? Let's look back at the text. Verse 25 is about speaking the truth to one another. For when we drop stones of deceit in the water, that can destroy relationships and trust. Verses 26 and 27 are about learning to handle our anger, learning to deal with it. For when we drop unresolved anger in the water, Paul Marshall writes, it can wreak havoc on the community. We're told to process our anger in healthy ways before the sun goes down, before anger has time to fester into unhealthy and long-held grudges of hate. Verse 28 talks about not stealing, but it's interesting. As Dr. Scott Schaff writes, not stealing is not based on the notion of respecting another's private property like we might think, but it's based solely on the motive of being able to earn enough to help someone else in the community. As one commentary puts it, the motive for moving from stealing to honest work is to have something to share with the needy. How's that? Verse 29 tells us to watch what we say, because what we say has ripple effects. Our words are meant to encourage and give grace. Jamie Clark Souls writes that if we took this verse seriously, we would probably think before we spoke, and we'd probably speak a lot less often. Words matter because they can either build or destroy. And verse 31 is a summary of things we don't want to drop in the water: bitterness, wrath, anger, slander, malice, things that can destroy relationships. And we have seen an all too bitter display of what verse 31 is about. Lately, turn on the news, look at your phone, touting and criticism. Some days it's too much, and I have to turn off the TV or stop looking at the updates on my phone. The ripple effects are not something I would want kids to learn watching from the back seat or watching from the next room or reading over my shoulder. Seeing people ridicule and mock others and cut them down. And with the election just around the corner, the language gets ramped up to an extreme. And words are chosen to provoke fear, provoke hatred, and provoke division. It can be too much to take, no matter what political party you claim as your own. Both sides. The world seems to be telling us to throw our weight toward what's listed in verse 31. Is that how we want to make an impact? No. Ephesians tells us as Christians we are called to a much higher, tougher standard. But we already knew that, right? If we look at verse 32, it's in there. It tells us choose kindness, forgiveness, reconciliation. Choose to be tender-hearted. If we're following Ephesians, we won't follow the world. We won't. We'll live in it, but we will be different. If we are following Jesus, we won't follow the world. We won't. We'll live in it, but we will choose to sound different and look different and act differently. If we're growing in Christ, we will be the ones who choose kindness and encouragement. We will choose honesty and gentleness and humility. We will choose to reconcile. And we will speak words that build relationships. And we will keep our anger in check because we will choose love. And we'll drop those kind of pebbles in the water. This is a practical application of the first 3 chapters. The writer of Ephesians says, we get to put skin on the peace that Christ has already given us. What a privilege by the grace of God. And then the writer ups the ante a little bit and says, live in love, walk in love, as Christ loved us. Be imitators of God, like children imitate a parent. And that is hard for us to do. Love like Christ does. Treat others, see others, have the kind of vision that God does when God sees people. But that's the kind of love, that's the kind of grace that is at work growing within us. Deepening our love of God and deepening no less than our love toward every single person on the planet, no matter who they are. That is the goal. That's what Jesus told us to do. The 2 biggest commandments, he said, and everything hangs on those. Word by word, choice by choice, attitude by attitude, day by day. That's what sanctifying grace is up to in our midst. And it's much bigger than we are. Thank God for that. I heard a story several years ago. There was a family that had been to church, much like we have been today. And they went out for lunch afterwards. And the parents were sitting there parsing out the sermon and different parts of it. And their fourth grader was with them, their daughter. And she piped up in the conversation and said, oh, Dad, the sermon that the pastor gives is the same every week. And they said, what? She said, yeah, every week. Blah, 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 love. No matter what he's talking about. And the parents thought this was pretty cute, so they went to the pastor and they're like, oh, our daughter said that all your sermons are the same. And they're all blah, 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 love. The pastor said his first thought was, thank goodness she's listening. And even better, she got it. She got it. That's what we're really about, isn't it? Drop a pebble in the water, just a splash, and it's gone. But there's 100 ripples circling on and on and on. What kind of ripples do we want to be creating in our community? What kind of pebbles are we dropping in the water with one another, at work, at school, at home, at play? Let us be the ones who are dropping pebbles of love down in that water. And by the grace of God, we just might change it together. I'm in. When it comes to that, my pebbles in, deep in the water. I hope yours are too. Amen and amen.